I followed my wife to the company gala dinner. That night began with a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain, a sixth sense, perhaps, or the weight of the silence that had settled between us over the past few weeks. Her messages became shorter, her touches more rare, her eyes avoided mine. But that day, something was different. The perfume she'd put on to leave wasn't one she usually wore with me. Her dress was too bold for a professional event. And the rush with which she left the house, it hurt. I grabbed my car keys without thinking twice. There was no plan, just the anguish of someone who already knows, deep down, that something is going to hurt. As I parked discreetly near the event venue, I felt my heart race. Not with doubt, but with the confirmation that had already been growing inside me like a festering wound. And then I saw her. She was with him. Not like you'd talk to a coworker, or like you'd thank a superior. She smiled like she hadn't smiled at me in months. He held her waist intimately. And then it happened, the kiss. The kiss that destroyed everything. The kiss that broke the dam inside me. I moved closer. I walked toward them both as if each step were the last in a world I knew. When she saw me, she froze. Her eyes wide. Her mouth half open. He tried to exit the scene gracefully, as if nothing had happened. She stammered that it was all a misunderstanding, that I was misinterpreting, that it was just a misplaced conversation, a gesture taken out of context. But I interrupted her. I looked her in the eye and said, in the most steady, calm voice I could muster amid my devastation, I know what a misunderstanding is, and I know what a flagrant is. Then I turned around. I walked towards the exit, leaving behind the echoes of justifications that no longer interested me. I returned home with my heart in tatters, carrying on my shoulders the weight of a life built with care, love, and patience, being dismantled in seconds. Each step on the cold living room floor felt like the end of an era. The silence in the house was deafening. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat on the couch, head in my hands, trying to remember when the person I loved most in my life became a stranger capable of breaking my heart with a public kiss. With a kiss displayed like a trophy. With a kiss that had probably been repeated for much longer than I could have imagined. The following days were slow and cruel. She tried calling, texting, even showing up at the door a few times. I didn't answer, didn't respond, didn't open the door. For the first time, she felt the weight of the emotional distance she'd forced me to live with for so long without me even realizing it. And I was beginning to understand that sometimes love isn't enough. That those who love aren't always loved back with the same intensity. And that there are betrayals that are committed not only with the body, but with a lack of care, with the constant choice to prioritize anything other than the relationship. She stayed with him. And perhaps she believed she'd won some battle. She gained status, presence at the most important meetings, recognition. A position. A title. But she lost something much more valuable. Over time, I heard that she didn't smile as much anymore. That her eyes were always tired. That their relationship was efficient, objective, functional. But cold. Soulless. Without tenderness. And then she started remembering. Our Sundays in the park, our dances in the kitchen to old songs, our late-night conversations about everything and nothing. She began to realize she traded poetry for reports. Love for position. And one day, like someone awakening from a long trance, she understood that what she'd lost wasn't just a marriage, but the only person who knew how to love her imperfections without ever making her feel small. That's when she decided to look for me. She appeared at my door with teary eyes and a hesitant smile, saying she wanted to talk. That she needed to talk about us. About everything that could still be remade. I listened to her, this time. I sat across from her as she reeled off memories, apologies, declarations. She told me her new love was comfortable, but never true. That she missed the way I looked at her, how I cared about the little things, how I made her feel alive. She said she'd made a mistake, that she traded a house full of feelings for a place where everything was appearance. That she wanted me back. But there, between her words, I realized something. It no longer hurt. The wounds had healed. Her absence was no longer absence, it was space. And in that space, something new was born within me. For the first time, I saw the woman before me not as the person who broke my heart, but as someone who, even though she regretted it, arrived too late. Because I had found myself again. I had learned to love myself without depending on the love of someone who didn't know how to appreciate what they had. That night, after she left, I found a forgotten box at the back of the closet. A box filled with photos of us, old letters, memories we treasured from a time when everything seemed eternal. I decided it was time to close that box forever. But first, I wrote a letter. Not to her. To myself. To the man who survived the pain, who endured the sleepless nights, the silences that hurt, the memories that bled. A farewell letter to the love I gave, but it wasn't enough. And in the end, I put everything in the box. I closed it carefully. I put it away. And then, I made room in my life for something new. What she never knew is that, in deciding to return, in trying to reclaim what was once ours, she found something she hadn't expected. Because the love she destroyed had been buried. And in its place, another was born, whole, light, and silent. A love for myself. A love she'd never known. A love that doesn't accept crumbs. That doesn't go back. She wanted to return, but she arrived too late. And it was in that moment, in that silent farewell, that the penny dropped. But what exactly did she find when she tried to reclaim what she had once destroyed? What secret lay waiting for her, guarded with delicacy and justice, ready to show her the quietest, most devastating consequence of her choice? She thought she still had time. But life had one last revelation in store. One of those that no one sees coming. One that changes everything, forever. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, never, any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but based on situations real and deeply human. Our goal is clear, to show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and forever marks the lives of those who truly love. Now, get ready. What follows is a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Good story. His name was Daniel, and hers was Helena. A couple who, at first glance, seemed to have been forged in a rare harmony, the kind that forms slowly, with time, affection, and small, silent sacrifices in everyday life. They met when they were young, in a university cafeteria, when she was looking for shelter from the rain, and he offered her the chair next to her with a shy smile. From that moment on, their paths intertwined organically, without any major explosions, but with a delicacy that only time can solidify. Both came from ordinary families, carrying traces of different histories, but with the same desire to build something real. Daniel was a data analyst, methodical, with a keen eye and a serenity that inspired confidence. Helena, on the other hand, worked in the administrative department of a large corporation. She was ambitious, determined, and passionate about organization, but also extremely sensitive to how she was perceived, the looks she received, recognition, and, above all, emotional appreciation. Their early life together was simple. They lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment, decorated piece by piece, amidst laughter and discussions about which color would look best in the living room. They had a common routine, shared breakfasts in silence before work, exchanged loving messages throughout the day, and impromptu dinners to the tune of playlists they both loved. Nothing was extraordinary, but perhaps that was precisely what made it so special. Daniel cared for Helena in every detail. He remembered to change the sheets the night before when she said she was exhausted, brought her flowers at the end of a difficult week, or prepared dinner even when she felt awkward in the kitchen when she said she was exhausted. And she, in turn, organized the household finances, kept up with appointments, knew what to say when he was emotionally stuck, and, more than that, made him feel seen, even without words. As the years passed, Helena rose to more important positions within the company. She started as an assistant, rose to analyst, and, after a specialization course, was offered a position as a team leader. Responsibility increased, as did the hours away from home. Daniel, on the other hand, maintained his professional stability, not for lack of talent, but out of conviction. She never sought leadership, she enjoyed the predictability, the security, and, above all, the time it afforded her. She liked arriving early, walking the puppy they adopted, making coffee, and waiting for Helena with an open book and a yellowish light in the living room, hoping she would throw herself at his side as she had in the early years. But little by little, their schedules no longer coincided, the windows of affection diminished, and, even without arguments, the routine began to develop almost imperceptible cracks. Helena started arriving later, justifying it with unexpected meetings, internal events, and team get-togethers. Daniel understood. He said he was proud, and he was. There was no room for envy or comparison in him. But deep inside, he felt the distance growing, not like a sudden break, but like an empty space between two bodies lying in the same bed. He tried not to show it, wanting to be a support, not a burden. But her gaze no longer lingered on the details as before. She passed over the gestures, the flowers, the lovingly prepared dinner. He didn't complain, but he kept it to himself. And his silence was a deep sea, impossible to navigate. One autumn weekend, they took a trip to a nearby town. His attempt to rekindle something. They rented a country house, built a bonfire, opened wine, listened to old songs. For a few hours, they were the same as before. They laughed, hugged, walked hand in hand along a trail through the trees, and Daniel felt a spark reignite within him. He thought, there's still us. There's still a chance. But when he returned, everything seemed even more distant. As if that moment had been merely a pause, not a new beginning. Helena immersed herself more and more in her work, in her goals, in the demands of a position that required not only time, but presence, charm, leadership, and availability. Daniel, on the other hand, was beginning to change. Not in essence, but in his attitude. He began to pursue new hobbies, signed up for photography classes, and started running in the mornings. He didn't talk much about it, he just did it. And little by little, his absence, previously filled with waiting and hoping, began to be filled with his own presence. The conversations, which once flowed easily, became punctual, functional. They discussed bills, building renovations, nephews' birthdays. The lightness was lost. The laughter faded. Helena didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. She was focused on maintaining the image that everything was fine, that evolution was natural. She told herself that this phase was just a consequence of adulthood, of the search for stability, for financial security. That romance was something that really wore thin, and that what mattered was companionship. Daniel listened, understood, but felt the love slipping away like water slipping through his fingers. What had once been vivid was now lukewarm. And yet, it remained. Not out of complacency, but out of love. Because I still believed that all of this could be saved. That all it took was a gesture, a look, a reunion of souls. It was in this context that the invitation to the company gala dinner arrived. An annual, elegant event, with important guests, speeches, and an atmosphere Helena loved. She was radiant. She spent days choosing her dress, booking an appointment at the salon, fine-tuning details. Daniel suggested accompanying her. He wanted to be there, to see up close that part of her life that so often seemed distant. But she hesitated. She said it would be a corporate event, that there wouldn't be room for guests, that perhaps it would be better for him to stay home and rest. He accepted, with a heavy heart, but didn't insist. That night, he tidied the house, prepared a light dinner, and put on some soft music. But none of it filled the void. She left, stunning. Beautiful as always. And he stood there, staring out the window, sensing something was wrong. His uneasiness grew, his body filled with discomfort. And then he grabbed his coat and keys and went. Not out of suspicion, but on impulse. He needed to see her. He needed to understand what had been lost along the way. And it was in that moment that everything changed. In that silent moment between doubt and certainty, between waiting and action, between the love that still resisted and the heart that was beginning to give up. Daniel couldn't imagine what he would find that night, but he carried with him the hope of reclaiming what they had built. Little did he know that, at that moment, fate was already preparing the breaking point. A point of no return, where silent truths would gain a voice. And love, which so often weathers storms, would be tested not by the absence of feelings, but by the absence of reciprocity. What had not yet happened that night would forever change not only the steps that would come next, but also the way he would see love, the past and most importantly, himself. That night, as the city glittered with gala lights and shop windows reflected the glow of seemingly discreet cars, Daniel remained silent behind the wheel, watching the activity around the hall where the event was taking place. The car window, fogged by his own breath, separated him from a reality that until recently had been only a remote possibility, being outside, observing a woman who once made him feel at home, and who now seemed to belong to a world that no longer included him. There was no anger in his eyes, at least not yet, only a contained anguish, a painful foreboding that formed in his stomach and rose to his chest. The street was busy, ride-hailing drivers stopping and getting off, men in suits and women in impeccable dresses smilingly entering the building decorated with sophisticated arrangements and a huge welcome banner. Daniel waited. The clock read almost 9 o'clock. The event had already begun over an hour ago. When he finally saw her get out of a black car with tinted windows, time seemed to slow down. Helena appeared in a dark blue dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Her hair was tied in a low, elegant bun, and her long earrings highlighted the curve of her neck, which he had so often kissed leisurely. She was smiling. A smile Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. Beside her, an older man in a perfectly tailored suit got out of the car and opened the door for her. There was no intimate touch, just formality. But there was something about their posture, the way she adjusted her hair in front of him, the way he watched her, that bothered Daniel more than he cared to admit. He waited for them to get in. Then he got out of the car, straightened his coat, and, without a second thought, headed toward the entrance. The room was full. The lights were low, instrumental music played in the background, waiters circulated with glasses of sparkling wine and delicately balanced trays. Daniel walked slowly, trying not to look out of place, as if he were part of the scene, even though everything inside him screamed otherwise. He spotted Helena on the other side, near one of the central columns, laughing at something the man beside her had just said. She held a glass in her left hand, while the other rested subtly on his arm. Daniel took a deep breath. He watched from afar for a few minutes. With each gesture, each smile, a part of him dissolved. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the recognition of an intimacy that didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the kind of closeness born of frequent conversations, comfortable silences, knowing glances. He knew. He always knew. But in that moment, he saw. And that changed everything. Still, he hesitated. He wanted to leave. I wanted to believe he was being irrational. But something compelled him to keep going. There wasn't enough noise to mask the sound of his own footsteps. His heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to leap out of his throat. When he was a few meters away, Helena saw him. The smile faded, his eyes widened, and his body stiffened. The man beside him turned in confusion, trying to understand what had caused this sudden change. And then, in an instant frozen in time, it happened. They both turned at the same time, as if the universe wanted to reveal everything in its raw form. Helena tried to say something, but Daniel was quicker. With a direct, firm, and deeply wounded look, he murmured, in a restrained and cutting tone, that he knew perfectly well what a misunderstanding was and knew, with equal certainty, what a flagrant was. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any shout. He turned, without waiting for an answer, and walked towards the exit with steps that tried to sustain the wounded dignity that remained in his soul. As he left the building, the night air hit him like a punch. His breathing was ragged, his eyes were watering. The world outside continued to spin, indifferent to what had just happened. People laughed in restaurants, cars hurried past, and he stood there, trying to understand when everything had gone wrong. He got into his car without saying a word and drove through the streets aimlessly, until the path led him back home. Upon entering, he found everything just as he had left it, the table set, the fragrant atmosphere, the warm light on in the living room. Everything ready to welcome her. Everything he had done, still believing there was something to save. He sat on the sofa and felt the weight of silence. A different kind of silence. Not the kind that comes from physical absence, but the kind that screams between the lines of disappointment. The hours passed slowly. Helena didn't return. Didn't call. Didn't text. Nothing. She simply disappeared, as if the previous scene hadn't happened. As if he hadn't seen it. As if the damage could be ignored. The next day, the absence remained. And the day after that, too. The messages that arrived were short, evasive, carefully calculated. Cold words from someone still trying to protect themselves from a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Daniel spent his days suspended, as if trapped in a limbo between the love he still felt and the pain that now guided him. She would wake up early, go for a run, come back and make breakfast just for herself. The apartment seemed larger, emptier. Her absence echoed in the small details, the vanity chair she left askew, the lipstick forgotten on the edge of the sink, the mismatched cups they used. And yet, he didn't touch anything. As if preserving the traces were the only way to keep alive something that had already died. Helena, for her part, remained immersed in work. Or pretended to be. She spent long hours away from home, avoiding any situation that would put her face to face with the consequences of her actions. She told herself that Daniel needed time. That she needed it too. That it was all a misunderstanding, poorly explained. But the truth is that an unbearable discomfort was growing inside her. The guilt, previously stifled by the euphoria of the new, began to manifest itself in the silences between appointments. In the averted glances in the mirror. In the lack of sleep at night. He began to notice that what he had with the other man was not what he imagined. There was status, there was companionship, there was attention, but there was no comfort. There was no lightness. Everything was a game of appearances, convenience, conquests. And what had seemed so exciting at first, now weighed heavily. A week later, he returned home unannounced. He found Daniel sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in his hands. He said nothing when he saw her. He just looked at her with the same painful serenity of someone who has already understood what needed to be understood. She tried to speak, but didn't know where to begin. She said she was tired, that she needed to think, that everything was confusing. Daniel just listened. He didn't argue, didn't attack, didn't question. He just got up, picked up the cup, and went inside. That hurt her more than any scream. Because it was the silence of giving up. The silence of someone who still loves, but no longer finds room to be loved. At the end of that day, Helena went out again. This time with no specific destination. She walked through the streets until she found a bench in the square where they usually strolled on Sundays. She sat there, trying to relive some memory that would make her believe it was still possible to fix what had broken. But everything seemed distant. As if the memories had suddenly aged, losing their color, their shine, their consistency. And it was that very week that everything came to light. The betrayal Daniel witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, nor an out-of-context situation. It was the tip of a thread he silently began to pull. Small absences began to make sense. The changes in behavior, the delays, the vague excuses. Everything now fit together with cruel precision. The photos he found on her computer, the archived messages, the restaurant reservation records she said she'd gone to with colleagues, everything pointed to an irrefutable truth. Betrayal existed. It was there, naked, raw, documented. And most devastating, it had been built gradually, not impulsively. It was nurtured in silence, while he still placed flowers in the living room and waited for a kiss at the door. And with this discovery, something inside him broke completely. Not love. But hope. The hope that love alone would be enough. But what Helena didn't yet know, was that in trying to fix what she'd broken, she'd come across something she'd never imagined. Something that couldn't be undone. Because sometimes life holds answers for questions that haven't even been asked yet. And hers was about to arrive. The meeting wasn't scheduled. There was no warning, no planning. It was an impulse that moved her, or perhaps a last gasp of conscience screaming for redemption. Helena arrived in front of their apartment building, holding in her hand a bag filled with things she'd taken from the old drawer in her work desk, a photo frame with a picture of the two of them on a beach, a keychain shaped like a camera he'd given her when they still dreamed of traveling the world together, and a letter she'd been writing for days, tearing it up, and rewriting it, trying to find the words that could restore something she'd destroyed. The sky was cloudy, and a cold wind blew along the sidewalks, as if announcing something important was about to happen. She climbed the stairs slowly, pausing for a few seconds in front of the door, trying to control her breathing, trying to believe there was still time. Daniel opened the door after 3 knocks. His face was serene, his gaze firm but distant. He showed no anger, nor hope. Only a neutrality that hurt. She smiled cautiously, as if testing the waters, and said she needed to talk. He nodded, making room for her to enter. The apartment was different. There were fewer things, more order, more silence. It was as if it had been purified of her presence. They sat on opposite sides of the room. She looked around, as if searching for something familiar, something that still connected her to that life, but found only the emptiness of what had once been. She began by saying she knew it was late, that she understood the damage, that she recognized her mistakes. The words flowed between sighs, charged with emotion. She said she had made the worst mistake, that she had lost herself in her thirst for recognition, that she had confused attention with love, status with achievement. Daniel listened calmly, without interrupting, but without becoming emotional. There was a frightening clarity in her eyes. She spoke of empty nights spent with a man who seemed perfect to others, but who never knew how to listen to her insecurities. She confessed that she felt increasingly small amidst so many appearances, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what they had together. She apologized, asked for a chance. She said she wanted to rebuild, that she was willing to start over, that she understood the value of what she had lost. He got up and went to his room, saying nothing. She stood there, her heart racing, trying to decipher the silence. When he returned, he carried a dark wooden box in his hands. He placed it on the table and sat down again. He told her she needed to see it before responding. Helena opened it carefully. Inside, she found old photos, letters, notes, and, on top, a white envelope with her name on it. It was a letter written by him. Dated 2 weeks ago. She began to read it in silence, her eyes welling up with each line. In the letter, Daniel recounted not only the pain of betrayal, but the silent process of rebuilding. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the days when the silence of the apartment seemed to suffocate him, the small daily victories in relearning to live alone. But there was something more. He revealed that, after discovering everything, he decided to distance himself from everything that reminded him of her. She took time off work and traveled to the countryside, to the home of her grandparents, who had already passed away but still held childhood memories. There, he rediscovered a part of himself he had forgotten, the lightness, the peace, the pleasure in simple things. And it was during a cloudy afternoon, sitting under the tree he used to climb as a child, that he met someone. It wasn't a romantic encounter at first sight. She was a neighbor from next door, recently divorced, the mother of a little girl, who also carried pain and scars. They began with small talk at the gate, book swaps, and evening walks. And, over time, her presence began to fill the empty spaces left by Helena's absence. She listened attentively, laughed at his stories, asked questions, remembered details. With her, Daniel felt seen again. Not as an accessory, not as an obligation. But as someone who mattered. Someone who, even wounded, was still worthy of love. When she finished reading, Helena let the letter fall into her lap. Her eyes fixed on Daniel, who remained calm, serene, like someone who has weathered the storm and now relishes the calm. She asked if he was with this woman now. He said yes. That they'd started something together a few days ago, but it was unlike anything he'd ever felt. He said it wasn't about comparing, it wasn't about revenge. It was simply about finding peace. Helena, for the first time in a long time, was speechless. She tried to smile, tried to maintain her composure, but a tear slipped. She asked him to look her in the eyes and ask himself if there was still a chance. Daniel stared at her for a few seconds and said yes, for a long time there had been. That he'd waited, that he'd fought, that he'd believed. But now, it was too late. Because loving someone isn't a guarantee it will last. And because sometimes, forgiveness needs to be given not to get back together, but to set you free. Helena, sobbing, said she didn't know he'd suffered so much. That she thought he was too strong to break. He replied that everyone breaks, but some learn to put themselves back together again. And that it was in this process that he discovered something she never saw, that the most powerful love a man can have is not for another, but for himself. He stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Not as an expulsion, but as a gesture of respect. She understood. She picked up the bag, the letter, and walked slowly toward the exit. Before crossing the threshold, she turned and said she hoped he was happy. That he deserved it. And he, with a slight smile, replied that he was trying. When the door closed, Daniel took a deep breath. There was no relief, no sadness. Only a profound sense of closure. That cycle had come to an end. With pain, with dignity, with truth. And as he walked through the house toward the porch, where the sun was beginning to peek through the clouds, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But fate still had one last piece to place on this board. A twist neither she nor he could have foreseen. A truth that waited silently to emerge, and end this story once and for all. 2 days had passed since their last conversation. 2 days of silence that wasn't just an absence of words, but an absence of connection. Helena spent the first few hours rereading the letter, trying to absorb everything she'd read, as if searching between the lines for some glimmer of hope. But there wasn't any. There was a disconcerting clarity in that farewell that, though silent, carried the weight of a door closing with no promise of reopening. And for the first time, she didn't try to resist. She was exhausted from fighting for something she herself had crushed. Yet, deep down, a part of her refused to accept the end without understanding everything. There was something in Daniel's gaze that seemed to hide more than he'd revealed. It wasn't just about the new woman. It was as if there was a limit he'd imposed not just on what he felt, but on what he knew, something he'd discovered and chosen not to verbalize. It gnawed at her. On the third day, Helena decided to reach out to someone she hadn't seen in a long time. It was her best friend at the company, Livia. One of the few people who knew the details of her journey with Daniel, who had watched the breakdown of their marriage closely, who had advised, warned, and, above all, remained silent when she chose to pursue the path of adventure. Livia received her with a certain coldness in her eyes, though she tried to hide it. They chatted in the building's cafe, the same place where they had so often shared confidences, laughs, and promises of change. Helena, between sips, poured out her heart. She said she had lost everything. That Daniel had not only moved on, but also seemed to have rediscovered a meaning in life she had never known how to give. Livia listened without interrupting. When Helena finished, there was a long silence between them. And then, with a sigh, Livia said something she hadn't expected to hear. He said that perhaps Daniel had freed himself at the right time. That the woman who entered his life wasn't just a new presence, but a natural consequence of someone who decided to no longer live with less than they deserved. Helena asked if she knew this woman. Livia hesitated for a moment, but then confessed that she did. That she knew before her. That she saw them once, by chance, in a bookstore downtown. They weren't touching, but there was something between them. A way of looking at each other, of smiling with their eyes, that couldn't be forced or invented. He said that, upon seeing that, he knew it was too late for Helena. That Daniel was finally whole. And that she, however regretful she was, would never understand what it meant to be loved by someone who demanded nothing in return but reciprocity. Helena returned home that day with a new weight on her chest. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was the recognition that she had lost not only the man, but the version of herself that existed beside him. She spent the night wandering the living room, looking at objects that no longer meant anything. She sat in front of the mirror for hours, staring at an image she no longer recognized. And then, on impulse, she decided to write a letter. Not to ask for his return, not to explain herself. But to thank him. She wrote with tears streaming down her face, with pauses between words, with her heart bare. She thanked him for the years by his side, for the silent coffees, for the nights he waited for her even when she arrived without affection. She thanked him for not becoming bitter, for remaining kind even after the pain. And in the end, she asked for just one last thing, that he agree to have coffee with her, just one coffee, not to get back together, but to end the cycle with dignity. Daniel received the letter in person, delivered by a motorcycle courier. He read it carefully, standing on the porch. When he finished, it took him a few minutes to react. This wasn't the woman he'd known, nor the woman who betrayed him. She was someone else. One who was finally aware of what she'd destroyed. And even though he no longer felt the same way, there was a point he knew he needed closure to. He called her the next day. He arranged to meet her at a discreet cafe, far from everything that reminded him of the past. He arrived early, as he always did. He sat by the window and ordered 2 coffees, one without sugar, the way she liked it. When Helena walked in, he recognized her immediately, though there was something different about her. It wasn't her clothes, nor her hair. It was her gaze. A gaze devoid of arrogance, defensiveness, or pride. She approached and sat down without ceremony. They exchanged a brief, silent smile, almost respectful. They began to converse lightly. They talked about their daily lives, about work, about the changes. Neither of them forced an approach. There was no longer any illusion. There was only the maturity of someone who accepts that time has passed. And then, as the coffee grew cold in the cup, Helena asked if she could ask just one last question. He nodded. She wanted to know if there was anything else. Something he'd never said. Something that had been kept hidden. A silence hung between them. Daniel stared at her, took a deep breath, and then spoke, with the same serenity he'd used at the company dinner. He said yes. That there was something. And that now might be the right time to tell her. He said that the same day he saw her with another man, upon returning home, he had an impulse to go to her office. Not to confront her, but to retrieve a document he'd forgotten in an old folder. And that, by chance, when he accessed the computer to look for the file, he found a folder labeled with initials and dates. He opened it. There, he found more than he expected. They were emails exchanged between her and her boss. Not just statements, but plans. Plans on how to manipulate internal situations to secure the promotion. Strategies involving secret meetings, undermining colleagues, speeches she practiced to deliver in internal interviews. All articulated with precision. It devastated him. Not because it was illegal, but because it revealed a side of Helena he hadn't known. Ambitious enough to compromise principles. And to do so, she gave up not only her love, but her very essence. Helena remained silent, her eyes wide, her mouth half open. Daniel continued. He said he hadn't told anyone about it. Not his new wife, not his friends. He kept it to himself. Not to protect her, but because it was no longer his place to expose someone else's mistake. That the betrayal of his body hurt, but what he saw on that computer was something else. It was a portrait of a woman he no longer recognized. And that, in that moment, he decided not only to leave her. He decided to leave behind any idealization. He decided he no longer wanted to try to save someone who had already chosen another path. He said he forgave. But that forgiveness wasn't a bridge back. It was the end of the road. Helena didn't know what to say. She just lowered her eyes, swallowing the bitter taste of truth. What she had always feared was revealed before her. It wasn't the new woman who had driven her away from Daniel. It was herself. Her choices. Her silence. Her inaction. She stood up unhurriedly, left a note next to her cup, and said, her voice breaking, that she now understood. And that, although it hurt, she was at peace for having heard everything. Daniel smiled slightly. He said he wished the same for her. She left the cafe, crossing the street as if carrying a different weight now, not of guilt, but of conscience. He stood there for a few more minutes, looking out the window at the street, and then stood up. Outside, the sun was peeking through the clouds. Life, finally, was opening up again in new ways. And although that story had been marked by pain, it was also the foundation of something new being built, in another place, with another woman, with another version of himself, more whole, stronger, and finally, at peace. The afternoon they left the cafe was the last time they saw each other. Their farewell was as silent as it was final, an unspoken pact that their story, however powerful and powerful, had no more room for rebirth. And, even as they walked in opposite directions, they both knew that, somehow, they would always be connected by something that doesn't fade with time, because there are bonds that, even broken, continue to vibrate at some discrete, almost imperceptible frequency, but that never completely disappears. In the following days, Daniel immersed himself in his routine with a new lightness, like someone opening the windows of a house that has been locked for too long. He returned to taking photographs frequently, started visiting different places on weekends, and allowed himself, guilt-free, to live in the present. He was building a new relationship with someone who made him smile effortlessly, with whom he shared comfortable silences and deep conversations, and with whom, above all, he didn't need to feign strength when he felt vulnerable. It was a serene love, without desperate promises or games of conquest. Just an honest connection between two people who found each other after losing so much. But still, there were days when the memory of everything returned, not as a wound, but as a memory. A memory of what was, of what could have been, and of what was lost. He would sometimes sit by the lake he had discovered on solitary walks and think about how strange love is, how it can be both shelter and prison, healing and poison. He remembered not the moments of pain, but those of tenderness. The impromptu dinners, the knowing glances, the feeling that there was a home there. And in these memories, instead of sadness, there was now a deep respect for his own story. For the journey that had to end for him to find himself. Helena, on the other hand, was facing cloudier days. After that coffee, he made drastic decisions. He resigned from the company. He no longer wanted to be remembered for what he did or what he represented there. He felt he needed a fresh start, but not the kind you get with a change of address or a haircut. He needed to start over from within, reclaim his values, dig into his own essence, and understand when, exactly, he stopped being the woman he admired. He spent weeks in silence, avoiding friends, family, and social media. He isolated himself not as punishment, but as a way of reflection. He compulsively read books about choices, morality, and forgiveness, and wrote pages and pages in diaries that he carefully kept. I didn't want to forget, I wanted to understand. He wanted to look back without hiding from his own shadow. It was during this process that she began attending an emotional support group. It wasn't traditional therapy, but weekly meetings where people gathered to tell their stories, hear others, and thus rebuild themselves. There, she heard stories of irreparable betrayals, of loves destroyed by pride, of people who lost everything yet insisted on carrying on. Hearing other voices trembling as they spoke of regret, she felt she wasn't alone in her guilt. And more than that, she learned that true repentance isn't the kind that seeks forgiveness from others, but the kind that transforms one's own life. In that space, she was no longer the woman who destroyed a marriage. She was simply someone trying to relearn how to love, including herself. Between meetings, he rediscovered small, forgotten pleasures. He began walking in parks in the late afternoon, chatting with strangers in cafes, and listening to old songs he'd avoided because they brought back memories. He rediscovered his passion for painting, bought canvases, paints, and brushes, and began transforming the empty living room of his apartment into a makeshift studio. He didn't sell, didn't exhibit. He painted for himself. It was his way of purging what he couldn't put into words. One night, in front of a white canvas, he painted a couple. Not their faces, but their intertwined hands, undone by an invisible wind that passed through the image. He cried. Not for what he lost, but because he finally understood what he had done. Meanwhile, Daniel allowed himself to deepen his bond with his new wife. He was afraid at first. Afraid he was throwing himself into something out of a need for fulfillment. But as the days went by, he began to realize that their relationship was born from a new, more mature, freer place. There were no projections, only presence. One afternoon, she invited him to meet her daughter. An 8-year-old girl, curious, talkative, and with a wide smile reminiscent of her mother's. Daniel hesitated, but went. When he arrived, the girl was drawing on the living room floor and, without ceremony, offered him a blank sheet of paper to draw to. He sat down, took off his shoes, picked up a colored pencil, and, for the first time in a long time, laughed lightly, uncomplicatedly. He realized, then, that life no longer needed to be a constant attempt to fix the past. It could finally be a construction of the present. But even with the lightness of that moment, a part of him still needed closure. Not with Helena, that had already happened, but with himself. So, on a gray Saturday morning, he took out an old box he still kept in the back of his closet. Inside were photos, letters, and objects dating back to his years with her. He opened everything calmly. He sorted the items. Some he put back. Others he put in a small bag. He left and walked to the park where they used to go on their anniversary celebrations. He sat on the usual bench. He observed the landscape. The same lake, the same trees. He picked up the bag and began to leave the objects there, one by one, in a silent ritual of farewell. There was no pain, no resentment. Only the certainty that this chapter needed to be closed respectfully. When he finished, he stayed there for a few more minutes, watching a mother pushing her child on a swing, an elderly couple holding hands, a group of young people laughing loudly. This was life going on. And he, finally, felt like he was part of it again. That same week, Helena was invited to give a talk at the support group. She told her story with a firm voice, without holding back. She said she had lost the love of her life, not through bad luck or fate, but through bad choices. That she had traded presence for prestige, affection for ambition. And that she now understood that worthwhile success is built with truth. The audience listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes. At the end, she was applauded. Not for winning, but for having faced herself. When she left the room, her chest felt light. For the first time, she no longer needed validation. She had accepted who she was. And even more, who she wanted to be from then on. Time went on. Daniel and his new partner began talking about bigger plans. Small steps, unhurried. She introduced him to her family. He took her to see his grandparents' house. Helena, in turn, moved into a new apartment. Smaller, simpler, but full of windows and light. She adopted a cat. She went back to school. She started a psychology course. She told herself she wanted to understand what drives someone to hurt the one they love. Not to justify it, but to prevent it. She began using her story as a starting point to help others avoid making the same mistakes. And, somehow, this redeemed her a little. Not from the past, but from herself. And so, worlds apart, yet connected by everything they'd experienced, Daniel and Helena continued on. Each with their own pain, their own scars, but also with new layers of maturity, empathy, and, above all, peace. Because some stories don't need to end with reconciliation. They just need to end with truth. And truth, though painful, always sets them free. But fate, while respecting the paths each chose to follow, still prepared one last curve in this road. One that would confront them both with an unexpected choice, and perhaps the most important of all. On a late afternoon, with the sky divided between clouds and a shy golden light, Daniel found himself in the makeshift studio he had set up in the back of the house. It was there that he found peace. The wall covered in black and white photographs, the old cameras he collected, the books stacked on the floor, and an open window let in a calm, warm breeze. He was alone at that moment, leafing through an album he had begun to put together with photos of the new phase of his life. Some landscapes, his new partner's daughter running through the yard, her smiling among sunflowers on a recent trip. Each image felt like a new page in a book he was now fearlessly writing. Beside the album, a small box containing a few old objects still remained. Not out of attachment, but out of respect for what had been. He picked up one of the items, a bookmark with a quote Helena had given him in their first year of marriage: "True love doesn't bind, it frees." And for a moment he stood there, reflecting on the irony of that message, how such light words could become so heavy over time. Across the city, Helena walked the aisles of a silent library. Her psychology degree, though recent, was already affecting her more than she'd imagined. Readings about human behavior, guilt, affection, and identity provoked increasingly visceral reactions. Theory blended with the practice of her own life. She'd chosen a topic for her first academic essay: the unconscious mechanisms of self-sabotage in romantic relationships. It was more than a paper. It was a mirror. As she organized her books on her desk, she received an unexpected call. It was Livia. Her voice on the other end sounded hesitant. There was something unusual in her tone. She said she had something delicate to tell him. Something involving Daniel. At first, Helena felt her stomach churn, as if her hard-earned peace was about to crumble. But Livia was quick to point out that it wasn't anything serious, not even personal. It was something professional. An invitation. A social project about emotional reconstruction after loss. Daniel's name came up naturally in meetings among the organizers. Not only because of his story, but because of his way of dealing with it. His ability to speak clearly about feelings and decisions without blaming anyone. The project consisted of lectures, workshops, group sharing, and the idea was that, at one stage, there would be a roundtable discussion with different perspectives on forgiveness. Helena had been invited as a student in the course, and Daniel as a representative of those who had experienced the pain of betrayal and managed to rebuild a new life. It was symbolic. And perhaps necessary. Hearing this, Helena fell silent for a few seconds. She took a deep breath. She thanked him for the invitation and said she would think about it. When she hung up, she walked to the library window and watched the people passing by on the street, each with their own destinies, their own untold stories. She wondered if she had the maturity to face this. Not for Daniel, but for herself. She no longer wanted to run away, and perhaps this invitation was more than a coincidence. It was a chance to face her own reflection in the most honest mirror there is, the gaze of the other who once knew us completely. 2 days later, Daniel was also informed about the project. He read the details carefully. When he saw Helena's name among the participants, he didn't react immediately. He put the email aside, went for a walk, and took a breath. There was no resentment, just caution. He didn't want to expose himself gratuitously. But at the end of the day, he decided to accept. He knew that his story, however painful, could inspire someone. And that was enough. The event took place in a modest but welcoming cultural center. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle. The audience consisted of students, therapists, people going through separations, and others searching for answers to their silent pain. Helena arrived first, nervous, carrying a folder of notes. When Daniel entered, their eyes met for a moment. She smiled discreetly. He returned with a gentle wave. They sat on opposite sides of the table. The moderator began the meeting with a gentle introduction, contextualizing the importance of active listening and non-judgment. Then, each guest began to tell their story. When it was Daniel's turn, he didn't speak as a victim. He spoke as a survivor. He said that loving isn't an act of courage, it's an act of faith. That trust is diving in without knowing if there will be ground. And that, when the ground disappears, the pain of falling isn't the only thing you also feel the emptiness of what will never be again. But that, after a long time trying to understand why he was betrayed, he understood that the right question wasn't why, but what now? He talked about the choices he made afterward, about the silent rebuilding, and about the woman who entered his life without promising anything, but offering everything. He spoke with a firm voice, his eyes shining, and in the end, he simply said, "Sometimes, we need to lose ourselves to discover what truly makes us whole." When it was Helena's turn, the room fell into absolute silence. She didn't read anything. She spoke from the heart. She said that for a long time, she used the discourse of seeking appreciation to justify selfish actions. That she confused empowerment with vanity, desire with need, and ended up exchanging true love for an image of success that crumbled at the first touch of loneliness. She said that, by losing Daniel, she lost not only a partner, but the woman who existed by his side. And that today, she was rebuilding each piece with humility, without haste. In the end, she looked at him and said in a low but firm voice, "Thank you for not destroying my name, even when you had the chance. Thank you for choosing silence over revenge. I didn't know it at the time, but that, too, is love." The audience applauded. Not for the story, but for her courage. At the end of the table, as the guests rose for coffee, Daniel approached her. They stood face to face. There was no longer any guilt or tension. He smiled, extended his hand, and simply said, "I'm happy for you." She squeezed his hand gently and replied, "And I'm happy for you too." And they stood there for a few seconds, like someone closing a book with gratitude. After that, there was no more exchange, no contact. Each returned to their new lives. But something had changed. The cycle had closed with dignity, empathy, and, above all, truth. In the following weeks, Helena was invited to continue with the project, now as a permanent assistant. She wrote articles, helped create groups, and became a reference in empathy and listening. Daniel, meanwhile, began a therapeutic photography course, teaching how to transform emotions into images. With his partner, he began planning a long trip, something he had always dreamed of. Her daughter already called him Dan and asked him almost every day when he would be back from work. Home now smelled of cake, the sound of laughter, and a peace he never imagined he would find again. And so, with different but equally fertile paths, both learned the greatest lesson of all: love, when true, demands no return. It merely transforms. And sometimes, the greatest proof that a feeling was real is how we manage to move on without destroying it, even if it's over. But fate, in its infinite ability to surprise, still held one last choice in store. One that wouldn't involve return, nor reconciliation. But a gesture, perhaps the most difficult and powerful of all. And that gesture was yet to come. On a Sunday with clear skies and a gentle breeze, Daniel got out of the car with a camera slung around his neck and a smile slowly growing on his face. He was in a nearby rural community, where he had been invited to document the activities of a project supporting vulnerable families. The place was simple, but vibrant, full of children running barefoot and adults smiling with their eyes even when words failed them. In that setting, Daniel was no longer just a photographer or someone who had overcome a history of betrayal, he was someone who deeply understood the importance of rebuilding. He took his time taking photos, stopping to listen to stories, handing out some images developed on the spot with a portable printer, and watching people's eyes light up as they saw their lives portrayed. It was like giving them back something the world had tried to erase. It was, for him, like giving back his own identity. For the first time in a long time, he no longer thought about what he had lost, but about what he was building. Meanwhile, Helena was organizing her new workspace. The support group had become an institute, and she had been invited to coordinate a new line of counseling focused on people who had damaged their relationships and were now seeking new meaning. It wasn't an easy role. She encountered stories similar to hers every day. People who, like her, had made terrible mistakes, destroyed families, allowed themselves to be seduced by immediate desires, and then had to face the ruins. But precisely because she had experienced it firsthand, her listening was different. There was no judgment, only firmness. She was direct, profound, and knew when a tear was sincere or when someone was still hiding behind flimsy excuses. She earned respect without raising her voice. Her authority came from experience, and her compassion from repentance. And it was there, among circles of broken people, that she slowly pieced herself back together. One night, alone in her apartment, she was painting a canvas with soft colors, shades of blue and gray mixed together. It was a rough sea, but with a ray of sunlight piercing the clouds. As she moved the brush, she paused for a moment and smiled slightly. She thought of Daniel. Not with pain or longing, but with a rare kind of gratitude. A love that no longer needed to be experienced to be respected. A feeling that didn't want a return, only that he was well. She knew he had moved on. She had heard, from people they knew, that he now traveled frequently, taught photography classes at community centers, that his new partner's daughter adored him, and that he seemed more relaxed. She was happy about this. It was as if, seeing him well, a part of her was also redeemed. Weeks later, during an event on emotional ethics in modern relationships, Helena was one of the speakers. She spoke with precision and delicacy, and her talk received a standing ovation. At the end, a woman approached and said that what she had said had saved her daughter's marriage. Helena held back tears. She realized that, even though she had destroyed her own love, she was now helping others avoid making the same mistakes. And that, even if it didn't erase the past, gave meaning to her present. But it was one unexpected morning that their paths crossed again, not physically, but symbolically. Daniel received a plain, return-unmarked envelope in the mail with a developed photograph. It was a painting by Helena. The image showed two silhouettes walking on opposite sides of a bridge. In the background, a sky between sunrise and sunset. On the back of the photo, there was only a handwritten phrase, "Thank you for being my sunrise, even though I chose to walk into the sunset." Daniel stared at the image for long minutes. Then he placed it in a discreet frame and hung it in his studio. Not as a symbol of pain, but as a reminder that love, even when it fails, leaves a trail of beauty. Life then went on as usual. Daniel was invited to exhibit his photos in a modest gallery downtown. Helena began writing a book about emotional reconstruction. Their paths were sealed, each with its own destiny, each with its own lesson. And while there was no romantic reconciliation, there was a silent reunion of souls who allowed themselves to grow from their own destruction. Helena never again related in the same way. Now, each bond was built with truth, with clear boundaries, with radical honesty. Daniel, in turn, loved more calmly, with more presence. You knew that trust isn't guaranteed, it's cultivated. And that true love isn't the kind that never suffers, but the kind that survives the truth. And so, the story ends with dignity. The woman who betrayed rebuilt herself by facing herself, without hiding her own mistakes, and today she helps others avoid losing their way on the same path. The betrayed man found not only a new love, but a new way of being, lighter, wiser, more fulfilled. Both lost something that will never return. But they gained truer versions of themselves. And, in the end, perhaps this is the closest anyone can get to redemption. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Did it touch you in any way? Comment below, tell us what your favorite part was, or what you learned from this journey. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss any stories like this. This story clearly shows us how betrayal destroys homes, corrupts feelings, and leaves deep scars. There's no way back. Love doesn't always survive. Often, those who betray don't just lose the other person, they lose themselves. So think carefully before hurting someone who truly loves you. There's no path to glory worth the pain of someone who gave you everything. And here on the channel, we make this very clear: we do not support, under any circumstances, any type of betrayal. Our purpose is to show, through fiction, that choices have consequences, and that true love deserves to be cherished with loyalty. Thank you for listening until the end. Until the next story.